Okay, so greetings from New Delhi, India, and a very warm welcome to everyone today, and thank you for joining us. My name is Shivani Chaudhary, and I'm the Executive Director of the Housing and Land Rights Network. And on behalf of the entire organization, it gives me great happiness to welcome you today. And the advantage of this online format is that we have people joining from various parts of India who we wouldn't physically be able to engage with, but also many people from around the world. And I think it's great, and I'm very happy that so many people have joined us today for an issue that we believe is extremely important. I'd also especially like to thank our panelists for taking the time to be with us today, and I'm really looking forward to this session. Justice A.P. Shah was supposed to launch this report, and I know many people were looking forward to hearing his keynote address. Unfortunately, he's had a family emergency and is unable to join us today. So we will miss him, and we're sorry he can't be here today. But I do promise you that this will be a very engaging panel discussion. We have some excellent speakers here, all experts in their fields, and we hope you'll stay with us for the entire time. So before we begin, a few technical issues. We are broadcasting this on YouTube, and the link is available. We are also providing live Hindi translation. So I'll just take a moment to explain that in Hindi. तो आज जो श्रोताएं हैं जो हिंदी में कार्यक्रम सुनना चाहते हैं, आज हम अनुवाद दे रहे हैं आपको। स्क्रीन के नीचे जहाँ पे भाषा है, आप देखेंगे वहाँ पे जापानीज लिखा है।
Not happening.
क्लिक करना होगा आपको, क्योंकि जूम में हिंदी का वहाँ पे नहीं लिखा है। तो जापानीज क्लिक करेंगे, एक सफेद झंडा होगा जिसमें लाल गोल है, उसको दबाने से पूरा कार्यक्रम आप हिंदी में सुन सकेंगे। हिंदी अनुवाद सिर्फ जूम पर उपलब्ध है।
I don't have an account.
Okay, and we also have an open chat box, and we would encourage participants to use this mostly to pose questions at the end of the panel discussion. So we will take some questions from there. So I think that's the technical issues, and I would like to thank our interpreters today, Ramesh Sharma and Naveen, who are helping us with the live interpretation into Hindi. So I'm assuming that most of you today are listening to this panel discussion from your homes. Imagine you're in your home and suddenly you hear loud sounds outside, right? You go outside to see what's happening, and you see 3 bulldozers and a very large police force. There are people in riot gear, there are police with sticks, they're screaming, there are loudspeakers. They're asking you to immediately vacate your home. You don't understand what's happening. Repeatedly, you're asked to leave your home with your belongings. There has been no prior notice. There's pandemonium in your community. Children are shrieking. You rush around, pick up a few belongings. How do you decide what's most important? You have old parents, young children in the house. You rush outside. The bulldozers are coming closer. The voices get louder. And right there in front of you, your home, that small home that you built with hard-earned savings over 5 years, is demolished brick by brick by a bulldozer. And you are just left watching. Can you imagine this? It's really difficult for all of us because we believe the law is on our side and something so horrifically illegal could not happen. But the shocking truth is that in India, over the last 3 years, 2017, 2018, and 2019, 568,000 people witnessed the forced eviction and demolition of their homes without due process. These are people with government-issued identity cards, recognizing them as citizens of the country. But when you ask anyone, why was my house demolished? You're told you are illegal. But what was really illegal? The entire process of demolition, which violated every law of the country. Your home is demolished and all your documents establishing your legal identity are gone. It's almost as if your house never existed, and now it's as if you did not exist. We are talking about 600,000 people, almost. But nobody cares. It's not an issue. Why? So today, we are here today to discuss this issue of forced evictions, which really is a human rights crisis. We need to say enough is enough. But how do you solve a problem when you don't have information about it? And that's why at the Housing and Land Rights Network, we formed something known as the National Eviction and Displacement Observatory in 2015 to document forced evictions in the country, because the Indian government has no data on evictions. What did we find? Over the last 3 years, on average, every day, the Indian state demolished 108 houses, almost 5 homes every hour. That means 519 people rendered homeless daily, almost 22 people evicted every hour. And this in a country that's talking about housing for all. Why is forced eviction not an issue of concern? What happens to people when they lose their homes? And I want to say at the outset that this data is a conservative estimate. It's only what HLRN has been able to document. The actual number is likely to be much higher. So it's even more shocking to think of what the actual scale of this crisis must be. Evictions happen in remote parts of the country that we don't know about. And yet, these are not statistics. These are real people. These are real stories. These are men, women, children who are dispossessed of their homes, who lose their livelihoods, who lose their education, who lose their hope for a better tomorrow. And among them, we find Dalits and Adivasis disproportionately impacted. Among them, we find women suffering grave human rights violations because of evictions, subjected to gender-based violence after the loss of their homes, increased risk of trafficking, violence, early marriage because girls lose their homes, and higher dropout rate of girls from school. We see that evictions cause rampant human rights violations. They push people further into impoverishment. They result in social and economic inequality. They adversely impact the economy. But yet, evictions continue across the country with full impunity for the officials and state agencies carrying them out. There is never an investigation and never is anybody held responsible. Most people who are evicted have no access to justice and limited remedy. What we found in our research just in 2019, over 20,500 people evicted as a result of court orders. So here is the judiciary entrusted with protecting your rights causing forced evictions, where the court actually recognizes the unlawfulness of evictions. We find that orders are mostly in the form of stays on demolitions, not true restitution of the rights of people. And where the judiciary does pass progressive orders, we find that they are not implemented. 10 years, 15 years, those orders are not implemented. But an order asking for demolition is immediately implemented. Why? Why is the state machinery so prejudiced against the poor in this country is something we need to reflect about. I think today we are here to highlight the findings of our report, and we will post the report online. So I won't go into more data here. But I do want to stress that we need to break this culture of silence around the issue of forced evictions. During the pandemic, at a time when we're told stay home to stay safe, even during this global public health emergency, Indian authorities demolished over 20,000 people. How can this be justified? So we need to recognize forced evictions as a severe human rights emergency that they are. We need to talk about the issue. We need to build state accountability, and we need to ensure that international standards are implemented to stop this gross human rights violation. So I'm going to stop speaking here, and at the end, I will share some of the recommendations that Housing and Land Rights Network proposes to address this very serious issue. But thank you for listening. And now I would like to turn over to our next panelist, Dr. Amita Bhide. Dr. Bhide is from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. She is a professor and dean of the School of Habitat Studies, and she's been instrumental at TIS for over 20 years, writes extensively and does very good research, if I may add, on issues of urbanization, urban inequality, governance, housing, slum rehabilitation. So Dr. Bhide, we are really happy to have you with us, and I would like to turn over the floor to you.
Thank you, Shivani, for making me part of this very important event and for drawing attention to a phenomenon which I think deserves a whole lot of more, I would say, energetic and very strong voice behind it, as well as the backing of several executive decisions and implementation as well. So I want to highlight just 2 or 3 aspects of the entire report which I have gone through, and something which is also associated with it. One of the things which I really observe is the way in which there seems to be such a continuity, I would say, between the pre-COVID, during COVID, trajectories that one sees with respect to evictions. It seems to be like the one constant which is there. And I think this is something which should be especially worrying to us, because there have been very strict, I would say there have been pre-warnings in some ways, which have been given by the UN commissions and the UN housing rapporteur, actually talking about how there can be tremendous dispositions which can be caused, and how that can overall increase the vulnerability to COVID as well. I would perhaps like to add here that even the Prime Minister, when he announced the first lockdown in March, he talked about how rents should be forgiven, and there should be abeyance of rents for the 2 or 3 months or the entire period of the lockdown. Okay, but that was the only, I would say, oral announcement which has been made. And in fact, during the entire pandemic, as the report points out, there have been over 20,000 people which were displaced by multiple causes. And the prime among these, I was very intrigued by the fact that there were 25 documented instances of displacement and eviction just in the period between March to now. And within this, 14 different cases are linked to just clearance of encroachment or clearances done by different government departments. Okay? So 2 things which become very clear is that who is doing the evictions, it is not private landlords against whom one is seeking protection, but it is actually something which is being done by different government agencies. And this is the continuing part of the legacy that one is seeing. In fact, I would also venture out to say, and this is not from the entire national experience, but from the trajectory that one is seeing in Mumbai, The post-COVID scenario perhaps attempts to be or appears to be even more grim, because it is the real estate sector which is actually seen to be the revival arm of the entire economy. And the minute that real estate sector is seen as the reviving part of the economy, there are all kinds of pushes which are being given to slum redevelopment on a grand scale in Mumbai. And the impacts of that are something which are scary. The other interesting part which I see, which the report brings out and which is very important and critical, is the fact that today there seems to be more complex forms of eviction, that people's homes are torn. There is no doubt. I mean, that remains the single, I would say, fact which people have to deal with. But the names which are given, and why are there inadequate protests with respect to that? What is happening in the courts and the government agencies which are dealing with that? And I think that is something, those hits and misses today, we need to think about more carefully. Number one, this is happening in the name of resettlement. And perhaps like forced eviction, one should talk about forced resettlement and how people are being considered ineligible for that resettlement. So when you are considered ineligible, that forced eviction does not have any meaning. It makes you into a label which is perhaps even more weak, because your home is gone and you are ineligible for resettlement. So where do you go? What happens to you? Plus, there are, of course, the impacts of that resettlement itself, because it creates a displacement of a kind and often has very negative impacts. The third form that I saw, in again outlined very interestingly in the report, is also of what happens to the homeless. And this happened also in the wake of COVID, and which is about forced shelterization of the homeless. Okay. The situation of the homeless in our country is very, very different, because they are not just family, I would say, destitutes, but they are people who are working, they are contributing to the city, and they are making different claims to perhaps spaces which are not recognized as regular residential spaces, but they are spaces nonetheless. And there is a whole lot of homing practices which are associated with that. In this context, shelterization of these homeless is also something which completely takes away their claims and the very, very thin claims that they have to creating their footholds in the city. And I think when you bring out this point about what happened to the homeless, I think that's very critical. Keeping people off the streets cannot be such a unilateral agenda where you do not respect choices of people, where you do not respect the dignity of people and force and impose particular conditions of living on them. And the final thing and final form I think that the report also brings out is in terms of gentrification, actually putting people in places where which they are not able to afford, and the impacts thereof. So today, I think brute forced eviction is also accompanied by all of these forms, and it makes it a much more complicated scenario. I also see that going forth and going further, there is one important point that all of us need to think about is, do we need these people at all in the city? I mean, is our imagination that we are going to drive away the poor, we are going to drive away the laboring bodies, and then the middle classes and the upper classes and the ruling classes of the city are going to live in this nice, clean, beautiful city? Our nice, clean, beautiful cities actually require all of these bodies. They are an essential part of what makes our cities work. And if they are an essential part of the city, then their living needs to be also accepted as that most integral part of the city. And we need to find ways in which these settlements can be accepted. That what is true beauty is to actually perhaps accept their claims and improve these settlements in consultation and participation of the settlers themselves. I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Amit. I think you raised really important points. And I think one other very alarming finding of our study was actually what you referred to, that for the cases that which we have information on resettlement, only 29% of the incidents was some form of resettlement provided. And so that's, I think resettlement has just become a euphemism for state-induced dispossession, absolutely. So now we would like to launch the report. So I would like to request all the panelists to please hold up the cover, that whoever we could manage to send it to. So these are some of the challenges of online spaces. So it's really an honor to have all of you here. And actually we would have also liked to dedicate this report to all the people who have suffered from forced evictions. And our aim is that this report would help to provide not just attention to their plight and their human rights violations, but also to help them access justice and achieve restitution for their rights. And I think the best thing would be that if forced evictions completely end. So thank you very much. There's no one to clap, but yes, there's a lot of hard work gone into this. And at the end, I will acknowledge my teammates who have worked very hard also to put this together along with us. So thank you very much. I would now like to request Dr. Usha Ramanathan to share her thoughts. As many of you know, Dr. Ramanathan is a researcher who's been working on the intersection of the jurisprudence of law, rights, and poverty. She has published extensively, speaks very widely on these issues, and recently, over the last few years, has done some groundbreaking work actually looking at issues of digitization, technology, state surveillance, and associated rights, especially rights to privacy and participation. She's also been a member of many expert panels. So thank you very much, Usha, for taking the time from your very busy schedule to be with us, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Shivani. I think there are a number of questions that your report raises, and you've been doing it year after year. And we know that there are a number of groups of people, and there's the Delhi task force, for instance. There are other groups working on this issue of homelessness, but not just of homelessness, but also of being rendered homeless. And what it's told us, and I think some of us are each of us is a participant in a different way in figuring out what we need to do in this world to stop it from being so cruel. And there are just some things that I'll just flag, because I think we keep having these discussions over time and it will continue. But I just want to say a few things to begin with. The first thing is that, and this came up in Amita's too, the idea of encroachment and the idea of illegality has dominated this debate for much too long. And institutions, including the court, have adopted this language with remarkable ease. I mean, it's like they slip into it like it's the only way to think about it. I think it's going to be a task that we have to undertake to dislodge these two terms. Because actually at one time when I was doing this, trying to figure out what is this idea of illegality, and you realize that when you go to these demolition sites, that the reason people are not putting back a fight and saying, how on earth can you destroy my home? And so many of them are busy, they have to find some way of saving whatever they can, comes because the idea of illegality has simply not been explored sufficiently. Actually, if you look at this, you'll find that it is a state that is both illegal and unconstitutional. And I'll just very briefly explain this. Unconstitutionality, I don't have to explain in the context where a state which is supposed to be preserving and protecting and fulfilling the rights of people is actually going around destroying the only habitation that they have created for themselves. The state hasn't even created it. So, I was looking at the Delhi Development Act, and in real brief, the Delhi Development Act was made in 57. It said you must have a master plan. The idea was that there should be integrated development of the city. and a Delhi Development Authority was set up, which was supposed to deliver on these promises. And to deliver on these promises, they were allowed to acquire land in the city and then redistribute it for various purposes. Among those tasks, among the most important tasks that they had was providing economically weaker section housing. And the DDA went ahead with the acquisition. There was a master plan in 62, they went ahead with acquisition. But by the 70s, two things were clear. One, that the DDA was, there was extraordinary corruption in the DDA. I remember the day the newspapers announced that rains had come, and even before some block of flats that they had constructed could be handed over, it melted, meaning like it just, so that's the level of corruption that there was. And inability. They said this, it's too much for us to deliver. So they then said, okay, we'll have cooperative group housing societies, and handed it over. And we know, for those of us who've had to belong to these, we know how much you need to be able to commit to be able to belong to these societies, and how those societies have to accept you. So where were the poor in all of this? And then when the 10th plan document came out, you found that 90% of the, of what should have been delivered, not just by the DDA, but across the country, what should have been delivered, 90% of that which had not been delivered was economically weaker section housing. So the DDA acquires land, and it's not just the DDA. I mean, it happens around the country with various development authorities. They acquire land and they use it for various purposes. But the one thing which they have to do, they don't do, which is providing economically weaker section housing. And then you blame the poor, you call them encroachers and illegal because they are on public land. It's a very weird situation. So I really think we need to reconstitute this idea of illegality. So too encroachment. Public land is for the public. And if poverty doesn't produce its own public, what does? That which cannot be private has to be public. So if I can't, so the question that follows up from that immediately is, can the poor ever be legal in the kind of legal regimen that we have? And if they can't be legal, then there is something unconstitutional about how this legality is constituted. So I think even in terms of ideation, we may need to go back and work on some of these things while we work on the rest. The second thing is, over the years we've seen, and I think, all of us have witnessed this, that there are phenomena that we notice. For instance, classes of people are considered as dispensable. Classes of people are considered as redundant. And classes of people are invisibilized. When you say in your report that there is no data, it's not an accident that there is no data. It's like, when you had all those projects, large projects of development projects, where masses of people were being displaced, there was no data on who was being displaced. It's not an accident. It happens because this data is not the kind of data that you want to be recorded and to have to respond to as the state. So this, this invisibilizing happens in part by not creating data. The data doesn't exist, people don't exist. So that's one of the ways. And I actually find it, I'm just coming from a session on data, datafication of the whole population. And you find that every person has to be accounted for in various databases. But the state doesn't have to decide, will decide not to create certain kinds of databases so that it doesn't have to take responsibility for it. This is really not okay. What I found fascinating, however, is, this notion of dispensability and redundancy has been on for some time. I remember in 1996 when they said shut down all the industries in Delhi, and they said, what will happen to all the workers? They said, well, workers came from somewhere, they were migrants, now they can migrate and go somewhere else. It's maybe among the most callous public statements that I've heard made. But it showed, and it was an idea that redundancy of populations meant that they can move on, we are not interested. Among the most fascinating things that's happened during COVID is, first of all, the visibilizing of the migrant. People who we would pretend didn't exist got visibilized. And migrants who come like this and stay and go are not going to be staying in high-rise buildings. They're going to be staying wherever they can find a little shelter where they can stay, create a home for themselves and stay there. And it was impossible then to deny that there are masses of people who the state has to be accounting for, but they've not accounted for. And it was fascinating that now you hear all around you how you're desperate for the migrants to return, or there will be no economy. So suddenly, redundancy and dispensability is finding itself being challenged. And I think we need to pursue this and explore ways of how we rethink and reimagine people who are in our midst. The one other thing that I would say and then stop is that what it does, what your report does, and what your reports over the year, and what the work of a lot of people who've been working in this field is doing for us, is it's asking us to address questions of the relationship between a state and a people. And it is asking us to look at, like I said, the notion of legality. Be bought, is that legality at all? Or is legality itself only commerce? That if you can't afford it, then you don't belong anywhere. So this, and there is a fascinating thing about the rural-urban divide, where the moment the trouble happens, you expect people to leave. When they are no longer relevant, you expect people to leave because you expect something which is far away from you to be absorbing all of them or taking them away. Like it happens with resettlement sites, constantly being told, those who get resettlement are told, you go to that place and it's not about integrated development of a zone, but you push them away to a corner so that they can't be seen. You don't want to acknowledge that they exist. You only want their labor. I think that made my heart sink, I just have to say it. The day after lockdown was announced and the migrant workers in hordes just started walking, the question that wouldn't leave my mind was this: what were they thinking when they set out on walking 1,000 kilometers with their families, with little children along with them, pregnant women beginning to walk? What were they? And I could come up with only one answer. It told me that for people in these conditions where they are fending for themselves, the expectation from the state and from society has dropped to zero. It's a very serious statement. They don't expect the state or society to come in to help them. They have come, if they work, they earn, they live, and they go. The fact that they would take such a risky journey and just walk without thinking told me that, that level of no expectation from a state and from a society is a shameful statement on state and society. And I think that, if we don't address it urgently, we're really going to find ourselves, it's a shame on us. It's really not about people at all, about the people who are affected at all. And one last thing, we were talking about eviction during COVID. I also found it fascinating that there are court judgments which had said that people who were in slum areas needed to be resettled and they were going to be given, housing in some, housing place somewhere. And that was to have been completed by March 31st. This is under the Kidwai Nagar flyover. And it was not done because because you had COVID and you had the lockdown. But like you say, it didn't stop them from demolishing houses. This is not even talking about, respecting the rights of people to be where they are. I'm talking about a court order that says, you give them what is there? The flats have been identified, they know where it is, they just need to be allowed to move. And you had people staying there saying, listen, I'm worried about staying here because we are 6 of us in such a small place. We are entitled to that, it's ready. Why are we not being allowed to move? So the question is, how do we change this idea of dispensability that the state has and of invisibilizing that the state has produced in relation to these populations? Because if anybody has been of use in this period, and if we are looking for, if the economy is looking for someone to come back and do all the work, it is these people who live in, in such precarious spaces.
Thank you so much, Usha, for raising these really critical questions. I think we need to engage with these issues so much more, and panel is not enough time to do that. But I think very important questions about public land, right? And who does the state work for, and what exactly is the state, and why is public land considered as government land and not people's land, right? I think these are very important questions that need to be examined and debated. And I think the whole issue of encroachers. And in our research, year after year, this is the third time we publish this report, we find that the reason for the maximum number of evictions, for the maximum number of people evicted, is removal of encroachments and beautification projects, right? And that just shows you how this notion that the low income communities are encroachers and removing them implies beautifying a space, you know, whether it's a city, whether it's a pond, whether it's a waterfront, is deeply prejudicial. And how do we rid these notions that are so entrenched in state policy? Because that's the policy that then gets implemented. And you see in Chennai how almost 37,000 people have been evicted from waterfront areas, you know, under the guise of disaster management. But they are shifted to areas which are flood prone and low lying. So, you know, is it really about their safety? And when you look at the project plans, it's to beautify the waterfront areas, you know. So I think the issue of class is very stark here. Like there's a certain class that you expect will benefit. Just like with your public purpose projects, the public that benefits from the projects is not the public that pays the price, you know, with the loss of their homes, lands, lives, and livelihoods. So these are serious issues that are all linked to the economic framework of the country that need to be challenged at that macro and economic level. So now I would like to welcome Mr. Milun Kothari, our last speaker for today. As many of you know, Milun has been the former special rapporteur on the right to adequate housing at the Human Rights Commission and then the Human Rights Council. He's also the founder of Housing and Land Rights Network. So we are all here because of him. And we are really happy that he's here. He's currently also the president of UPR Info, an international organization that works on the Universal Periodic Review Mechanism of the United Nations. And Milun has done a lot of work on international human rights standard development and has written on these issues as well. So thank you very much, Milun, for being with us today.
Yes, thanks very much, Shivani, and hello, everyone. Namaskar. So first of all, congratulations to HLRN for yet another excellent report. As Shivani mentioned, I've been working on this issue for over 30 years in different capacities, and I continue to remain intrigued in quite a despondent manner as to why forced evictions continue to happen all over the world. It's one of the most intractable, unrelenting phenomenons of our time. We know why they happen. There is a very useful thematic breakdown in the HLRN report. And behind that, of course, I think we know the principal drivers of development-based displacement, economic policies, political choices that governments make, land grabbing, property speculation, that led by a scale of real estate speculation, rampant urbanization, changes in rural land and agricultural practices, climate change now, carbon credits and green energy policies. So we know that. We know what the drivers are. We know how the evictions take place. Shivani was explaining at the beginning in the brutal manner that they do take place. And we know theoretically and legally what needs to be done. We have national standards. We have case law in India, like the Sudama Singh judgment, the PK Kaul judgment. We have international standards like the basic principles and guidelines on development-based displacement and evictions. We even have examples from around the world, cities like Barcelona or Seoul and Gwangju in South Korea, who have been able to significantly reduce forced evictions. Singapore with its progressive housing policies. But these, by and large, are not replicable, and many governments are not complying with them. But evictions continue unabated, unrelenting, without a break. Why? Why have we as a global society, as a national society, why have we abandoned the displaced? Why is there no international or national outcry? Why is there this inscrutable, deafening silence? And why does this remain, evictions remain one of the most compelling yet unaddressed in terms of solutions phenomenon of our time? I mean, I think it's important to reflect on this, and in the years of work that I have done, I have reached several sort of in a sense insidious conclusions that global institutions and national and local governments are indifferent. And I think Usha reflected on this, are indifferent to the phenomenon of forced evictions. But what I have noticed is that it's an indifference with conviction. Such a conclusion is buttressed by the rationale we hear most from those that are responsible for driving people from their homes and land. They say this is the price we have to pay for development. Oh, these people are displaced, as Usha reflected, because they're illegal, they have no rights, and other such callous, inhumane explanations. And in my work as a rapporteur, when I was doing missions in different countries, the most chilling of these excuses that I heard from a senior bureaucrat whose government continued to evict people was that, sir, and I quote, "If you want to make an omelette, you have to break some eggs." The omelette he was talking about is development. The second reason that I can think of, and I think this is something that is quite, there's a great deal of evidence, is that evictions and displacement continue because those that are responsible, government officials, business leaders, landlords, developers, are rarely, if ever, held accountable for their actions. There are few, if any, criminal charges and subsequent prosecutions of individuals who make these decisions that lead to evictions and displacement. There is increasingly national and international exposure of those that are responsible. So we know the people who are doing it, but rarely are the prosecutions of individuals or criminal liability established also for national or global corporations. And there is a, so we get to this question of, okay, so we try to understand this great phenomenon, this very debilitating phenomenon, but what is to be done? One of the recommendations made in the report is there should be a moratorium on evictions. I'm not so sure if that's an answer. I think the problem is that in the countries, we do not have adequate housing policies that protect the poor. So, one of the best models is something called the housing continuum, where you would have a housing policy that's based on shelters with care, rental housing, cooperative housing, and at the far end of the spectrum, working people's hostels, and at the far end of the spectrum, you would have ownership housing. If we had policies like that, which guaranteed security of tenure for the poor, and we also have the second special rapporteur's security of tenure guidelines to help us. If there was something like that, perhaps evictions would reduce. We also have in India, we have an excellent example of the Odisha Land Rights to Slum Dwellers Act, which is quite a remarkable sort of human rights-based legislation, which is potentially going to ensure that there will be no evictions, and in fact, people will get security of tenure of over 5 million households, and it has two interlinked objectives: to provide security of tenure to slum dwellers against the constant threat of eviction, and to create a legal basis for improving the livability, so upgrading the settlements. So that's one good example. We have the National Homestead Act, which hopefully will come in the near future. We already have a Homestead Act in Madhya Pradesh, which if implemented would significantly reduce rural evictions. But beyond that, I think one of the aspects I was thinking of is that it would be very useful if we could get the youth in the country involved. Our youth today are incredibly mobilized on climate change issues, now on the environmental impact assessment discussion. And it should be possible to perhaps get them agitated also about human rights violations like forced evictions. And of course, we need to get a much more strategic way special rapporteurs involved. The current special rapporteur, Professor Balakrishnan, very committed to this issue and wants to take it up in a very robust manner. There are other rapporteurs on extreme poverty, internal displacement, violence against women, the right to food, who can take it up. And I think so it's a question of I think the HLRN report really wakes us up again that the task before us is daunting, but the alternative to allow gross human rights violations such as evictions to continue unchallenged and allow for an increase in the number of individuals and institutions to continue to do this with impunity, to cause great harm to millions of people worldwide, not only in India. So the need is to put our minds, hearts, and capacities together, and that need has never been more urgent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Milun, for sharing those important thoughts. And I think, yes, we need to look at good examples and we do have some in the country, as you rightly mentioned, and our report also calls for recognizing the right to homestead, because as we've seen also now with the migrant crisis, as to how important home is. I mean, home has always been important, but how people live in this country has never been an issue of concern. So a lot of the people living in cities have been invisibilized. That it's an invisibilized form of homelessness. When you live, in factories, when you live in construction sites, you're homeless, but you're not just counted as homeless. And I think having secure tenure is really important, even in the rural areas, because we all looked at people going back. We didn't ask why did they leave the villages in the first place. And I think understanding the linkage, even with evictions, displacement, housing policy has to be integrated across the rural-urban spectrum. And I think we need to link the policies. And I think that's a big flaw in India, that the housing ministry is with the urban focus and the rural development ministry looks at rural housing. So I think, integrating these at the policy level also requires more interministerial discussions, and the Commerce Ministry is not involved in housing and land policy issues, whereas they are the ones pushing for these evictions in many cases. So we have to be really cautious, I think, now that the post-COVID recovery plans do not allow planned evictions, because we're seeing how environmental laws, labor laws are being diluted, and under the guise of infrastructure development, we are likely to see more evictions, because again, the economic recovery cannot be the only benchmark. We have to look at human rights-based recovery plans, and I think that's something that we need to be careful about. The need for an integrated housing policy is something that we've been talking about for a long time. Upholding the right to housing as a human right, as recognized in international law, is something that's really important, because we're seeing increased financialization of housing, treating housing as a marketable commodity. And now we have a good recommendation from the government to create, affordable rental housing complexes. But what is going to be the role of the market if it's a public-private partnership? How is affordability going to be defined? We all know that affordable housing is really for those who have the money to afford housing. It's not housing for those who don't have money. And so how do we ensure that, issues of justice, equity, fairness, gender equality, caste discrimination, discrimination against tribal populations are all brought onto the table of developing an integrated housing policy in the country? I think that's really important. We have a lot of other recommendations, but I think we have little time, and I would like to take some questions if there are any questions to specific panelists, or I think mostly we've had comments from people. I think the issue of the injustice meted out to Dalits and tribals and Adivasis is very, very alarming and stark. It has to be addressed. And that's why the report also calls for disaggregated data. And, it's been very difficult for us to get that data because we're a small institution, but and it doesn't exist at the state level. So, as something that Milun said, getting the youth involved, but I think getting other groups and movements to also look at evictions, because evictions is not just a housing rights issue. It's a women's rights issue. It's a child's rights issue. It's a right to food issue. It's a right to health issue. It's a right to work issue. It's a right to safety and security issue. And if it's one thing that this pandemic has shown us, it's that adequate housing is so critical to people's safety, health, and lives. More people are dying when they don't have adequate housing. So I think those issues really need to be brought to the forefront. Would the panelists like to say anything? Maybe final words. I don't see any questions, specific questions for anybody.
There is a question, and a very important question to the panelists.
Yes.
Which is, environmental activism often conflicts quite directly with housing protection. How do we resolve these complex issues? And they say normally the housing rights issues are really sacrificed for the sake of environmental activism. So how do you make sure that these both are protected? Because the housing rights, especially of the excluded, is not really taken out much more assertively. Is a question from Mukta Naik.
Usha?
Shivani, I was thinking that anyway we need to make a distinction between post-eviction and housing rights, because while we might figure out what the policy and law needs to be on housing rights, the point about post-eviction not being all right, that it's not okay, and recognizing that a state which is unable to provide cannot be a state that destroys, should be something fundamental in the discussion that we are having, so that we don't lose this focus. Because even within and when going to Mukta's question, actually this is true, it is not new. We've had this, for instance, in Borivali National Park. It's been a long, it was a long going discussion where the environmentalists went to court saying that within the park there are all these slums, and therefore you need to get rid of, you need to move them away from there, because otherwise it's going to, the only green lung that Bombay has will get lost. And there were battles between these two, and what we don't seem to recognize as people who are outside the state system and outside the system where we can control decision making, which is what the state does. The decision not to do is as much a decision as the decision to do. Learning that rights are not mutually exclusive, but that we learn how to read the rights together so that nobody's rights get destroyed. And you learn this idea of coexistence within, among rights and among people. This is an exercise that all human rights people will have to do. I think we are far advanced beyond where we were then. I remember in the 80s, the environmental movement saying that all tribals have to move out of core forest areas, or else the forest will get destroyed. Now the number of people saying that is a really, really small group, and advocates who represent them are always apologetic that they are having to do this. So it has made a difference having these debates and teaching people how to think. So I'm not hopeless about that. But I would, in the discussion that has gone on, I think we do need to see, it's not like we've never had a discussion on what do you do when people have to be moved out for whatever reason. If people have to be moved out of where they are, it can't be through forced eviction. If people have to be moved, it has to be by respecting their rights while you are requesting them to shift. And that will require a policy which in the early 1990s, when VP Singh was around, there was one law commission document that was made which recognized this as a right on resettlement. And so resettlement is not about destroying and then saying, okay, some of you can go and stay in a resettlement site. Resettlement is not about the resettlement site. It is about people's lives. So I think, the youth today, the extent to which we were seeing these things, even within civil society and even within academia, the idea that all these exist in silos. And so if I work on women's rights, I only work on women's rights. If I work on forest, that has broken down to quite an extent. I'm not saying it's altogether gone, but it's opened up spaces for talk. And I think, you know, Mukta herself is someone who would have done a lot of this. And, you know, where we kind of move between various kinds of rights and talk about it. So it is work, but it's work that's doable.
Shivani, if I can, on this question that's come repeatedly about environmental activism versus human rights activism, I think it's, in a way, the responsibility of all of us to maybe in a large manner carry out this human rights education to inform the youth that, you know, the fundamental assault on dignity that takes place, as is very eloquently explained in that report, when people are evicted, you know, the dignity of the individual, the collective identity of the community. And I think that needs to be done. I remain optimistic that our youth are more sensitive, this current generation. But I think it also reflects, I mean, the fact that they would go for something like environment versus human rights also reflects a failure in our education system in the country. Because people are not taught, even in colleges, there's no foundational course on human rights in schools. I don't know if the new economic policy can handle this, but I think that if we have a sort of large scale series of, and there are 4 or 5 youth groups in the country that are quite active, to sensitize them to this issue, it would be, I think it would be very useful. And I just want to make a point that in the global standards, the UN guidelines, the point Usha is raising, that there is actually a right to resettle, but there is a process that has to be followed to do that, which respects people's human rights. So I think the standards are there. The question is, how do we get them adopted, and how do we sensitize the decision makers to these standards? Thanks.
Thank you, Amit, Usha, and Milun for that. And I think at the ground level for communities, the human rights and the environment are not separate. Human rights and environmental rights are linked. Their right to water is part of and protecting the river is interlinked. You know, saving the forest and their right to food is linked. So I think these artificial constructs are often created in policy and then perpetuated as people being, you know, at crossroads with the environment. And I think understanding that at the grassroots level and again documenting people's experiences in protecting the environment is something that needs to be done, because very often the people who live within the forest are not the ones, you know, cutting down the forest or responsible for deforestation. There are questions to the panelists on the adequate housing standards. I don't know if anybody wants to take that. We're already at 6 p.m. There's also a question on comprehensive policy dilutions in the post-COVID scenario. Would any panelists like to take a second or two and then we can see?
Amita, can you just take that?
So actually, I have a counter question to the question on comprehensive policies, because in my view, if you look at the entire history and trajectory of housing policies at the national level or perhaps at the state levels, what we are seeing is increasing statements on policy, very frequent ones, and at the same time only a select implementation of some of them. So there seems to be like a real agenda, and then there seems to be like a packing stuff, which is not supposed to be implemented at all. Okay, and some of the real meat or perhaps some of the progressive agendas perhaps lie in that packing stuff. Right? How does one hold the state accountable to policies, and especially what is the meaning of a housing policy? You cannot have a, so if you start looking at the listing of policies, even at a national level, you have a national urban housing and habitat policy, right? Followed by that, you have a affordable housing policy. Then you have a rental housing policy. Then different states have policies. Then now you, besides these affordable housing policies, you have a PMAY, which again often does not conform to all the aspects of the national urban housing and habitat policy. You cannot, it is impossible just now to create a scalar order of policies. And different states again have their own versions of policies. For example, just to contrast two states, the government of Maharashtra housing policy, which was prepared in 2006, is really a assembly of different projects that they would like to undertake. There is no objective, vision, mission, nothing, okay, for that policy. And as opposed to that, you can look at around the same period, I think just 1 year after that, 2007 or 2008, you have a Kerala state housing policy. And that policy is extremely comprehensive in terms of even the considerations and the subjects that it tries to touch in terms of housing. Okay. In terms of implementation, both of them, there are real questions and real issues on the ground. Okay. So my belief actually in policies is, and that policy is what one should fight for, is something which is diminishing very, very rapidly. Policy is not something that one should perhaps work on. What is required really is, yes, there has to be a public acknowledgement of data, not just linked to evictions, but also linked to claims. And the more that one can expand this, because for me, one of the most shocking parts of your report, Shivani, is the fact that today we are not just talking about mega cities, but you are talking of Chintu-Pintu towns who are also undertaking evictions. Now, is one talking about really such contestations and price of land for which eviction is needed? No, not necessarily so, right? So the expendability of people seems to be the real, in some ways, force, and that we are able to divide spaces in that fashion. And I think that is something which is a challenge as a society we need to think over. Housing is just a, I would say, an expression of it, I would say. And I think even if there were 5 programs of the state, that would be fine, but we should be able to hold the state accountable to those programs.
Thank you so much, Amita. Those are really important points you raised. And I think this whole issue of land is really at the crux of a lot of the evictions that we're seeing, and use of land, and how we're seeing spatial inequality really being perpetuated in cities to control, and the real estate value of land is, I think, something that's really important. Is there somebody else who would like to say something? I think maybe if the panelists would like to say a few words each one before we end.
Yeah. There was a question about how to what the agenda of the special rapporteurs is, and I think those of you who are participating in this, if you could be in touch with HLRN, which can help you to reach the special rapporteurs. I know the current rapporteur, as I mentioned, Professor Balakrishan Rajagopal is very committed to carrying forward the issue of evictions, but he can also undertake particular communications on evictions cases, and perhaps also help us in mobilizing other special rapporteurs. So please go through HLRN. There was also a question about what are the elements of the right to adequate housing, and I just wanted to say that the ones that are there from the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, habitability, location, and so on, are very much following sort of economic, social, cultural rights perspective. But when I was rapporteur, we expanded those to include the civil and political rights dimensions, to include issues like privacy and security, freedom from violence, right to participate, and a number of other issues. So if you look at reports from 2007 and 8, you will find these explained. And I think that I just feel that this webinar has been a very useful way to actually, it's great to see so many people participating. And I think if we could all remain in touch, perhaps through HLRN, and obviously there's a need for webinars that are more focused on specific issues that have been raised at this particular session. So let's please continue with the conversations, and also if people have ideas on how we can go forward, not only with the youth, but generally, it would be very good if you could share these with all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Milud. We also have an expert who's helping us with the panel discussion today, Paul Divakar. And I was wondering, Paul, would you like to say a few words before we end?
No, Shivani, I'm just here to listen and help, and it's been great. And one of the panelists have also asked that, specifically in the context that we know that a lot of these evictions are about Adivasis, about Dalits, and those who are abused by the caste system. I think you have tried to have disaggregated data. So it will be good if we can have those especially joined with the protection under the Scheduled Caste, Scheduled Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Act. I think that has not been sufficiently used, and we need to really have, as one of the panelists said, not only document the evidences of eviction, but also document the claims that we need to really make to ensure that the realization of the rights for housing is really taken up. And one of the other things that I've noticed is there was a kind of a reminiscence of the fact that we had and I think Melon was the one who had initiated this housing rights campaign. And I think there was a lot of kind of a wider impact, especially at the grassroots this has created. And maybe something like that we need to re-engineer, which is really suitable for the current times, in order to see that, that kind of a sandwich strategy of building the claims from the community, as well as ensuring that the policy implementation really takes place. I think this is something that you're already focusing on. Probably we need to link it up wider with the movements. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul, for all the technical assistance. And I think if there are no more comments, we could wrap up. Would any panelists like to say anything? In closing, anything? So I think really the issue is to how do we end the impunity for evictions, and if we have criminal liability pinned on officials, or we have a judgment, or we have a precedent, I think that would really help us. And I think just getting the issue out there, and we really hope that journalists who are listening today continue to write more about this issue, because as I said, there's a culture of silence, acceptance that this is okay, that people are dispensable, and nobody is dispensable, nobody is illegal, and we have to work to defend the Constitution, to defend international human rights law. So I would really like to thank a few people here, especially our panelists, for taking so much time to be with us from different parts of the country, all the participants who have joined us from various parts of India and the country. Thank you so much. We've learned so much from all the panelists today. I would like to thank Paul Divakar for helping with technical assistance, Naveen and Ramesh for the translation. I think we were able to reach more people because Hindi was made available. And I would really like to thank my team, without whom this report would not have been possible, co-authors with me who have worked very hard on this report. So I would request their videos to be turned on so you can see them. That's Ayushman, who's a legal researcher at HLRN, and Anaga Jaipal, who is a research associate, and Deepak is not available. Okay, so I have another colleague who's not available on the screen. And I'd also like to mention Shanta Devi, Devpal, and Vanessa Peter, who have also contributed to the report, and all our partners across India who have helped us with data and been willing to collaborate with us on this project, because as you can imagine, it's a huge task getting data on evictions. And once again, we are always hesitant about putting out this data, because while it is really shocking, we always feel that it must be more, and we hope that more people will join us to get the truth out there. And I think we're all here to speak the truth, to ensure that human rights violations do not continue. And I think it's a very strange time that the world is going through, this pandemic that has shaken the mask of so many social protection gaps in our society. But if we don't recognize these failures, and if we go back to the normal, I think that will be a huge mistake. And you know, when we all thought that at least during the lockdown, at least during the pandemic, we won't have evictions, that did not happen in India. And I really hope that we can change that. And I think the collective strength that everybody brings is really a source of hope and inspiration, and learning from panelists and people who have, you know, spent their lives fighting for human rights. It gives us all hope. And I think there's a lot of hope in the youth today and in the social movements. And, you know, we need to protect very basic human rights. So once again, from HLRN, thank you very much for being with us. We have crossed a little bit over 6 p.m. but I hope it was worth it. And I will immediately put the report link and the press release link on the chat, so everybody will have access to that. And please stay in touch, and we hope to see you again soon. So thank you very much. Before we end, oh yes, Deepak has joined, so he's another contributor to the report. So thank you very much to our team at HLRN, and thank you all so much. So before we close, I will put the links to the reports. Okay, so you have the report and the press release. So thank you very much from HLRN, and goodbye.
Thank you.